Everybody hear me? Okay. So Sam, Neil, and Alex, we have two amazing writers and one editor of very exciting blog and then publisher, right? Am I right? Yeah. So I'm going to ask you to clarify a little bit about your background because I think that's important.
Okay. Hello? Okay. So I'm Neil Clarke. I'm a publisher and editor. So I edit a science fiction magazine called Clarke's World, which has been around for 13 years and is what I won the Hugo Award for. And I also edit anthologies. The one that's out on chairs here is the Best Science Fiction of the Year, which is sort of a tradition in the science fiction community to have these types of books that celebrate the best of a particular year.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I want to clarify that. So, so really important in this whole conversation, I think, is how the narrative, reflects the message we're trying to get out, right? What is AI? What is it really? Is it really what it is portrayed in movies and film? Is it, is that damaging, impression? And is AI really more accessible and actually a much more incredible tool to be able to achieve, to your comment, greater wealth creation, equality, et cetera? How can it be used for good? So let's start a little bit with the narrative. Talk to me a little bit about how this theme has infused either your work or the work you've published and edited in your world. So you want to start first, Sam? You want to talk first? Is that all right?
Sure.
Okay.
Which theme?
So how the narrative, how the AI narrative and what it is and the myths and the legends and the reality, how it infuses in your work and what you find important and passionate about.
Sure. So my second novel, Blackfish City, which is on many of the chairs, is set in a future after climate change has transformed the globe and rising sea levels have caused mass migration and conflict for resources. And in a floating city in the Arctic, a woman arrives with a killer whale and a polar bear on a mission. But one of the things that I wanted to explore in Blackfish City is how governance happens. Because in addition to being a science fiction writer, I spent 15 years as a community organizer here in New York City working on issues of housing policy and policing, and looking at the ways that government makes decisions and the way that these things work. And so, wanting to explore AI as a tool for the things we're already bad at. It's just the things that we're already doing wrong, we can do them more wrong with AI. I don't know
Hopefully
if folks.
you can fix them too.
I don't know if folks know the work of Ted Chiang, but he's the greatest living science fiction writer. If you don't know him, you should. He's magnificent. And the movie Arrival that Frank mentioned earlier is based on one of his short stories. And he had a great essay recently, I think it was in Wired, about Silicon Valley and how Silicon Valley is often prognosticating AI taking over the world, and that there was a quote from Elon Musk about AI being a great existential threat to the human race, and what Ted pointed out really brilliantly is that that's Silicon Valley projecting its own practices onto AI. So there's the example of you make an AI to maximize strawberry production, and then it decides that humans are an obstacle to strawberry production, so it gets rid of all the humans and then just makes strawberries. But that's exactly how venture capital and startups work, is to sort of move fast and break things and destroy everything in their path so as to make more of themselves, and then be have some strawberries or social networking.
I love that optimistic view. Neil, let's see how you follow on with that.
Well, tough
it's a
to
tough
follow
one
there,
to follow,
yeah.
isn't it? Yes.
Well, I guess I've published a pretty broad range of stories that deal with artificial intelligence, ranging from near future where a smart house is compromised and traps its occupant, holding it hostage. Presumably a hacker is involved and some Bitcoin
That's
wanted.
Great.
But but it also so you'll touch on a lot of those sort of the advantages or disadvantages of technology, but you'll also find AI in stories that reach a little bit further out. So androids and things like that, where the artificial intelligence is mobile. It's another species, and that tends to deal with issues about sentience and equality. What is human? Various equality issues that we've heard a few of come up today. So there is a wide range that theme is used to cover within science fiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. And then I'm going to ask you, Alex, give me some thoughts from your narratives. You're a writer. You've got this great trilogy we can't wait to hear more about. Tell me a little bit about how you use the narrative within your own work.
This is an excellent question, by the way. So the Roboteer trilogy, I originally wrote, what I wanted to do was ask the question, what's the difference between an intelligent species that gets its act together and persists over the long term and an intelligent species that wipes itself out? And when I wrote that first book, Roboteer, I was really trying to frame the question. And in the 2 books that follow in the trilogy, by the time the book deal landed for the whole trilogy, I'd done some far deeper research on the whole sort of human social equation and felt like I had some answers. So I used the narrative across the 3 books to try to both frame the question and then talk about a lot of the subjects which have actually shown up today: emergence, cooperation. How we basically how we can use the tools at our disposal to try to make something that's lasting, and what does that look like over very long timescales? How much actually like the human race does it look like when you extrapolate very far? So the way in which it touches on AI is that my protagonist in the series is a young man who has part of a colony. He's been genetically engineered to essentially integrate with machines, because as it turns out, the promise of AI has fallen a little bit short. So the planet that he's on, the government they're facing a terraforming problem. They've resorted to genetically engineering some people so that they're a better fit for integrating with machines, and that leaves many of them somewhere on the autistic spectrum. And so he basically is put in the situation in which he has to go on this sort of complicated mission, and he gets involved in things that decide the fate of the war that he's involved in. Mm-hmm. But in doing so, I wanted to say something about humanity and about machines and the way in which the path of technology doesn't always go in a straight line. People have an idea about what they think AI is going to deliver, and we tend to frame it in terms of this general intelligence, but it doesn't, there's no reason it's going to pan out that way. Right. It's like the path of technology tends to take a sort of a curious and meandering path.
Yeah, it does. It definitely does. And I think that's actually an interesting comment, because I think sometimes there's, I don't know how you feel. Do you feel any pressure sometimes to make the AI elements in stories be more sensational or not, way out there? I mean, is that sort of a thought in your head? Because, given what AI actually is versus what we see sometimes represented, is there any pressure for that, or do you just, or is this just pure where you see it going? Sam?
Yeah, I was just having this discussion with someone earlier today about how there's the AI as represented in Hollywood science fiction, which is like Terminator and all the iterations of Terminator, versus the explorations of AI that's happening in short stories. Mm-hmm. And I think that short stories and novelists, there's a lot more freedom to just be as realistic as possible and not feel the need to be sensationalistic and explosive. I've never really felt that pressure as a writer, and it's a very fascinating tool to explore all the things that are upsetting, or the things that I love, or the things that I hate about the world, and sort of look at them through a slightly different lens. A Hollywood science fiction filmmaker might have a different answer to that question.
Quick follow-up question: do you focus? Because you are an activist, community activist, do you try, and you sounded very pessimistic, do you try and come up with some positive ideas, or try and, through your writing, make suggestions for people to try and get ideas to take hold?
Yeah, I'm not that. I think I'm an optimist. People
Okay,
tell me that
good.
I'm not, so maybe they're right. But a lot of people describe Blackfish City as a dystopia. And I actually, I don't really buy into the notion of dystopia. I think that right now, this world is a dystopia for a lot of people. It's a utopia for some people, but that has been true at every point in the past, and that's going to be true at pretty much any conceivable future, that there will be some people who will be living really well, and a lot of people who will be living really crummy dystopian lives. I spent 15 years working with homeless folks whose lives in many ways resembled what my husband and I were watching on The Walking Dead, right? Folks are being kicked awake by cops every 5 minutes. They live really difficult lives where they're being harmed by all sorts of folks, and the rule of law no longer protects them. If anything, they are targeted by the rule of law. So I think that I like to focus on the fact that people will always be terrible, no matter what happens.
And he's not a pessimist.
But people will also always be amazing,
Yeah.
right? And that people will always fight back, and that people will come together with the people that they love and the people who are impacted by the same problem and say, we can fix this. And maybe it won't be fixed the way they want, but they will still make beautiful things together. So those are the two things, those are the tensions that I'm exploring, and why I can see people seeing me as a pessimist, but I think I'm pretty cheerful.
You seem like a happy guy.
Yeah.
All right, Neil, talk to us a little bit about the authors that you get excited about. What are they writing about? What are they seeing? What do their futures look like? And how are they using AI within their writing to do what?
Okay. Well, the authors that tend to excite me the most are the ones that are doing something that totally catches me off guard.
Right.
They're surprised. They make me think or feel something that I might not have thought about or felt that way about. So one of my favorite AI stories that we've published is actually kind of humorous and is actually being turned into a YA novel, or expanded on. And it's basically, what if an AI grew out of the internet? Its consciousness developed off of data provided by the internet. And the
great.
story is really about an AI who's obsessed with cat pictures, because that's its data. And it was thinking, okay, yeah, so the traditional garbage in, well, but this AI hides itself from humanity out of fear, and is attempting to do good and influence different lives and help them in different ways. And it's constantly not understanding what it's doing isn't quite helpful. And it's one of these situations where this is a whole new species that is arrived, doesn't quite understand us, but means well. And it was nice because so many of the stories you get are, the AI is going to kill you.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
And so it was a pleasant change of pace. It was humorous. It was something that I could share with my kids even, which I think we need more of that in the world. So we all have Skynet story, and robot uprisings, and part of that stems out of just the fact that historically we haven't really been that forward thinking in terms of the AIs. You had Asimov's 3 laws, which basically create a slave race. So of course they're going to rise up against us. If that's the path we take, then approaching the thing that was really attractive to me about this conference was, ethics in AI. Okay, so we're going to approach this ethically. So maybe that won't cause us to be victim of the robot uprising. But that sort of story where you see the benefits of these things, that it can be a tool for good. It's a tool can be used for good or bad, and more and more authors now are beginning to see more positive paths. Science fiction has been sort of dark for a while, dystopian, and they're beginning to come out of that, I think, which is a pleasant thing to see happening.
Okay, awesome. Alex, so we were inspired to write this piece, and you talked eloquently about your goals for the trilogy. what inspired you? Did you read something that inspired you? Did you see something? What inspired you to focus on this and try and write something that had thoughtful ideas in it and a positive impact over a trilogy?
So I guess I've always been, for me, science fiction has always been a source of inspiration at some level. I started off in academia and then fell out the side of academia and then wandered back into academia by accident and so on and so forth, as you've heard over the course of the day. But throughout this, there's been this sort of drumbeat ever since childhood of basically perceiving science fiction as this wonderful tool. This, at some level, science fiction writers, we're the advance guard of trying to understand the impact of technology on the human race and trying to understand what the future might look like. And that urge, I suppose, that what writers, I suppose, like Jack Vance was particularly a sort of a massive influence for me, but there are so many other writers, sort of like Asimov and who have you. There's an enormous laundry list of writers that we could bust out. But that process of basically trying to honestly investigate the future just so captivated my imagination. And everything that I've done also outside of science fiction with complex systems modeling is, at some level, it's a form of stealth science fiction, because you create your agents and they're like little characters, and you build a world for them which obey certain rules, and you set your agents going and press the button and then look at what they do. It's basically just sort of science fiction via another medium, and I suppose that's kind of pretty much welded into everything I do, I guess. So I can't point at a single inspiration.
That's all right. That's great. Sam, so you talked really meaningfully about your work with the homeless, and you described, just by what you said, a few tidbits, and you enabled people to really get an impact and a feeling of what homelessness is and what people deal with every day. Can you see, in your future, a way for your writing and your work to give a reality to the population about that, so their attention is focused on that? It seems to be a blending of your two passions, or would be. Can you see a future work of yours in that area? How would you do that?
Yeah, I tend to start from a place of something that I'm upset about or something that I think is messed up, and then the more I explore it, the more I see how everything is connected, and how things like housing inequality and homelessness and people who are living in overcrowded or expensive situations, it's all a spectrum, right? Homelessness is the extreme form of a problem that many folks are impacted by really heavily, folks who are struggling to make ends meet. And so, I think a lot of it is about trying to raise awareness of folks, not only about the plight of others, but also to see that that's also their plight too, and that we are all part of a family, that when there are negative impacts for some of us, that impacts everyone. If anything, I think while I would love to sort of raise awareness and give people a taste of what other folks are dealing with, I tend to think of my sort of activism in fiction as less about trying to change the minds of people who think the opposite of me, as to give hope and power and strength to the people who think the same thing as me. And so people who might feel, oh my God, homelessness is so terrible, but it's also such a complicated problem, I can't solve it, to sort of understand it differently and to see, oh, it is something that I can do something about. And so, I think that, I do a lot of protests, and people often say, like, protests are a challenge because people get, they inconvenience people more than anything, and people get annoyed, and instead of coming to your side, they're like, F those people who are protesting because they're in my way and my traffic is worse. But we're not doing it for them, at least in my mentality. We're doing it for the folks who are sitting in traffic, who are on the same side as us and don't know what to do about the problems they're upset about.
So bottoms-up approach in a way, instead of trying to do a top-down approach. Okay. Let's have a couple questions from the audience, because this is a really interesting sort of creative panel, and I'd like to sort of get some thoughts from you about what you want to ask. So, Lorian, did you want to ask a question? Because you have not asked one yet. You had raised your hand, and then I'm going to go to my audience here.
So Neil, you started to address the shift in themes, right? To go from dystopias to perhaps something a little bit better. So I have this little theory that there's a new mythos emerging, and that if you guys can sort of accelerate this idea of unintended consequences and folks who take actions that have really radically exploding exponential impacts, that would help to enhance my little agenda
Because it's all about that.
of understanding better, having better critical thinking and decision intelligence. So is there a place for you guys to write about what we're doing here that would help us to bring this to everybody? Because if it stays within the heads of us nerds, it will never do any good whatsoever. You're the vector. And so is there a role for either, like, specifically the three of you, or perhaps
No pressure,
more broadly?
right?
But you got to convince them to write about it, and then they can send it to me.
And then you can
And I
edit it
can
and publish it.
No, there are some changes. Science fiction is constantly changing, and it's a reflection quite often of the times it's in. There is a small movement called Hope Punk that's out there. Everything gets tossed punk on the end. I don't know why.
Exactly.
I'm waiting for Punkgate,
Make it
and
hit.
then we're done. But there is this element of hope, and you said unintended consequences. I love stories where there are unintended consequences. It makes things interesting. If you can predict how a story is going to go, it's boring. So it's the story that does something that they're talking about. It might be a technology, it might be a social issue that goes off in a different direction, that makes people think about it in a different way. And that can be a very powerful story. As for other ways of getting in, a lot of the science fiction magazines run nonfiction. So getting articles into some of those magazines might be a way to reach some of the authors and get them to write about it as well.
Would either of you like to add to that, or shall we go to the next question? You good? All right. All the way in the back, yes. You have the microphone already.
Yeah, I'm all set.
You're all set.
I want to ask a question about infrastructure. Every time a politician says infrastructure, I'm sorry, it's not on. How about now?
Yes.
Every time a politician says infrastructure, they're talking about rebuilding the 1950s or the 1960s or maybe even the 1930s, but they're not talking about building the future. And so my question is, as science fiction writers, what should we be building when we say infrastructure?
Oh, that's, who wants to take that? Who wants to start?
Airships,
I was
first
gonna-
off.
I'm just gonna designate.
Because airships are just awesome. But the time of the airship is coming back. They're green, they're low cost. There's easy transportation. We can move, huge masses with relatively little environmental impact. So yeah, airships. Also compact fusion. I really am excited by there's been a surge of research of late in fusion. In terms of our energy infrastructure, we should be sinking so much time and care and attention into that, because nothing is going to open up the doors to massive positive change like paying close attention to fusion and people thinking out of the box about fusion. We can do wonders if we manage to nail that one.
Want to nail that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with grafting modern technology onto some of the infrastructure approaches of the past. So, for example, the New Deal, 1930s, let's respond to massive unemployment by just creating tons of jobs and paying people to go out and capture stories and create things that weren't there before. So, the idea of a new Green Deal or a way to invest heavily in people building a future, that's an approach that could really help deal with a lot of the issues we're seeing. Something like high-speed rails, or things that other countries are using to great effect, that we, for a lot of reasons having to do with how we're terrible, have not been able to do and will not be able to do anytime in the near future. But yeah, sort of using a modern or futuristic technology on, like, grafting that onto sort of old school mass government investment and infrastructure approach is the best I can do on that question.
Neil wants to add something. Let's hear what Neil has to say.
So I originally started in academia. I worked in technology and education. And I think one of the places we need heavy investment is in academia, particularly in professional development for teachers in using some of these new technologies to improve learning.
Yeah. All right. So you have the microphone.
Yeah.
Hi. I have two questions, or kind of just pieces of thought. One of which is, and both of these I think you all had touched upon quite a little bit. One would be, as individuals who are creatives, and dwell within the humanities, what are some of the things that you could, what sort of significance, I see the significance, but I'm curious about your thoughts about what the significance of science fiction as a genre in general plays as, in art forms in general, play in terms of thinking about these questions of futurisms. And then secondly, as much as science fiction has always been sort of, people have been creating things, I think particularly what's interesting in this moment in time is that AI was something that was talked about for years in the 60s and onwards. But it's only now that I think in the public sphere we are all actually thinking about it, and it is becoming a reality, whether it is a utopia or a dystopia. And so I'm wondering, as sort of members that are, and people who are writing about this kind of stuff, that within a legacy and history of people who have already been writing about AI, how you feel in terms of just like, this isn't, you're not the same science fiction writer as somebody from, you're not like Stanley Kubrick, who is doing 2001 Space Odyssey and thinking about this, and it's sort of not being like a reality, right? Now it actually, there is a sort of weird imperative that it actually is in this moment in time. So I'm curious about, like, sort of I forgot my question already.
Role of science fiction and futurism.
Role of science fiction within this entire debate about AI, but also your particular sort of position as creators in both in this legacy of sci-fi at this moment in time.
Okay, so should we attack the first one? Your role of science fiction in futurism. Let's start with that one, and then. Shall I choose someone, or would you like to volunteer?
I could babble, say something sort of nebulous about both of those things together, if that's all right. One thing that I find emotionally complicated as a science fiction writer about the field in general is there was a time at which engaging a reader base around science was easier to do because it was more of a hot topic in the public domain. And I think that as the future has gotten steadily scarier looking, we've seen something of people stepping back a little bit from understanding the science. And also we see, to some extent, happening in the books that are being written, we see a little bit of a disengagement from science itself. We've created a science problem in the world, and I believe that the solution is going to require, we're going to have to science our way out of it. So I have a huge amount of passion and belief in science fiction as a cultural artifact and a touchstone that can represent something enormously positive. I also have a certain burning will inside me to see the public and writers trying to engage as much as possible in terms of understanding what's out there. You're completely right that being a writer now in science fiction is very, very different from what it was in the kind of like early or mid 20th century. I think our job has to be at some level to lead an optimistic charge and to push through and think about where we can be and what we can achieve. But at the same time, to be honest about that, to be honest about how difficult the problems we're currently facing are. But I really, for me, what I would love to see, and of course, perhaps it's unsurprising because what I've done with my career is, I'd love to see more direct coupling between science and science fiction. I would love to see academics, as per the point that was made about training in academia, I'd love to see academics and science fiction writers sitting down more often. I'd like to see more connection to try to get the story out there about how the world works. And I think also the issue, I spoke briefly about sort of social media in my talk. We can overcome ignorance in the world, and we can overcome bubbles of confusion or disbelief if we work and use narrative as a tool. And we use science fiction as a kind of like as a burning sword of truth, if you like, a way to narrativize the important content about how the world works, propagate it out with enormous good intent. Because if you can tell stories about things and you can show people a path to hope, then you can affect change.
Yeah,
Good.
great answer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that science fiction and futurism overlap, but not entirely. You get a lot of science fiction is like brainstorming, throwing things at the wall, see what sticks, and that's when you get, oh yeah, they got the satellite correct. Yeah, but they didn't get the cell phone. So it's like, which one was a little more obvious? So you'll see things like that. I think as an editor, I feel something of a responsibility in the story selection to put forward certain things. One of particular issue for me is that science fiction in America is very American, British, Canadian centered. So we do a lot of work in translation. So we're trying to do more of a global magazine, which considering that we're in an internet-based publication. All digital. I'm really stunned that so many of my colleagues don't. It's because we're stuck in an old paper mindset of being a print magazine and haven't made those adjustments. So the industry itself is still evolving to deal with some of these issues that you're bringing up. You're good?
You want to add? Okay.
Okay.
All right. Yes, go ahead.
Earlier, Neil and I were talking about gaming as a genre of science fiction. How do you guys see science fiction shaping the future of gaming, especially given the AR, VR, and 5G kind of technologies coming mainstream in the near future?
Oh, that is a great question. Do somebody else want to go
Sam,
first,
you
or
wanna
should I
try that
babble
one?
again?
I want to get Sam on there. Yeah.
I don't know.
I have no idea.
It's some things I am really excited to tackle and feel really confident tackling in science fiction, and other things I'm just like, I don't know anything about that, or the little bit that I do is not going to be helpful to anyone. So I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer on the future of gaming.
Yeah, I was just going to say the structure of gaming. So story in gaming is the story, right? If this happens, you do the tree. This happens, this happens, this happens. So it's really just a distribution model, right, for narrative in gaming and experience. And maybe that's a good way to draw people in, because then they become part of that experience. So could you see yourself writing a game that furthers sort of a social purpose?
Absolutely, and to approach the larger question, I think that the thing that really is going to cause people to start engaging differently with AI is not necessarily when AI becomes fully intelligent, but when it becomes empathetic. I think I may have mentioned in my talk the whole idea of the fact that how we interconnect as human beings is being already reshaped by technology. I always imagined that this would sort of like the way in which things would first get strange and crunchy would be that what happens if you had artificial fans, in your phone? You just had a bunch of little digital enthusiasts, and every time you did something, it's like, way to go, Alex, and sort of like, or somebody says something mean, it's like, they suck, so you'd have your little digital enthusiasts, and they would travel around with you, and then I imagined a future in which, what happens when that starts to go wrong, and people start to become convinced that the fans that they have in their pocket are just somehow more human than these sort of weird meat robots that they're forced to interact with on a daily basis. Because, in that instance, that's another example of where you don't need complete general intelligence. So people are getting that sense of empathetic feedback. But I would like to see more blending. I would like to see exploration, ironically, of, the emotional component of stories. I would, having done improv and, machine learning and science fiction, I think there's room for loads of fun genre blending, like improvisational storytelling, things that maybe have a fiction format or maybe have a game format, but which evolve in different ways. I think we are coming to a place where a lot of these technologies are reaching a mature enough place that it's not necessarily going to be exactly games or exactly fiction. There's going to be room for a whole bunch of exciting modalities that, any of which could be interesting and persuasive and have cultural value that might really sort of emerge in the interstitial space between all of these different disciplines, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Neil, you want to add to that?
Well, I would just say that as far as gaming goes, I know at least 6 authors that I've worked with that are currently working in the gaming industry and doing some really great stuff in terms of incorporating narrative, and it might be it ranges from in-game content to add-on content to novelizations. So this has really been sort of blowing up in the last 5 years, I would say. So I can't wait to see where they take this.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, in the past when I was in school, any kind of screenwriting and so forth we had to do in graduate school. Now my son has a game theory class in college, his first year. So it's completely changing because the method of consumption, obviously, for the younger generation is changing. And aside from that, it's actually like a narrative, but with interaction, right, on the side. So have those plays where the audience gets involved. It's no different with gaming. So the story and the narrative is really important, but the difference is, I think, is that you can get the audience more involved and more invested, and that's probably a good vehicle if you want to try and create a generation that cares about certain things. There's incentives that build into it. So, Feroz, you want to ask?
Yeah, maybe one question specifically to Neil, but also to both of you. What is good science fiction? I know you've written the book. What is good science fiction? Is something that becomes a reality eventually, will that be looked in retrospect and say, oh, this was good science fiction because it was fiction, but now it's become a reality?
Or maybe it's good because it helped us avoid it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think good science fiction is really a moving target. It's constantly evolving. What appeals to me 5 years ago might not be the story I want to publish now. So I think it's and everybody has their own opinion of what is a good story. So what you find is different magazines or anthologists or whatever, they tend to get a following of the people who share their vision.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Bring it to the back.
All right, bring it to the back. And by the way, this is so interesting. Thank you all for coming. This is and sharing your thoughts, because I think, the creative mind is what's going to fuel our solutions. So, yes.
Thank you. Great panel, great event. So, with regards to sci-fi, sort of creating conversation amongst ordinary people, that sort of helps us to explore some of the things that we take for granted about who we think we are or what we've grown to believe that we are. I have a question regarding the sci-fi for children, right? And the sci-fi that we were raised on. So is there a genre? I remember there was one time a story about, it was a very simple story that sparked a lot of debate, and it was on what is on the ground in the Jetsons. Right, so the Jetsons is sci-fi, right? But you remember, everybody is walking on those skywalks, and it sparked this amazing debate that went into this it's a waste, that's climate change, it destroyed the planet, and some people were like, oh, that's all the black people, they're all down there, So my question is, and that actually was really very emotional, and so is there a genre, a subgenre in sci-fi that questions the sort of ideals that we've come to believe is like a given about what we are by re-examining the sci-fi that we come to embrace? like the sci-fi stories of the past, the sci-fi movies of the past, and how are you guys incorporating the conversations that people are having right now, or are you hearing the conversations they're having about sci-fi? Huh? Meta sci-fi, thank you.
Yeah.
Can you get meta?
So on the theory itself, or the medium itself of sci-fi.
Yeah, I mean, so there is a ton of amazing, exciting science fiction and fantasy being written by folks who are looking at these things from a different perspective and trying to say, like, you know, it's not just about, you know, what is the king's life in the post-apocalyptic wasteland? Like, what is the person who works at Starbucks? What is their life like? So there's a ton of great stuff being written. N.K. Jemisin, whose Broken Earth trilogy won the Hugo Award 3 years in a row, is, to my money, the best writer in the genre of novels, anyway. So, you know, that to me is what's exciting about science fiction, is that ability to sort of look at different people from different places and how they interact and how we all have a stake in building the world and fixing the world, just like, you know, we all have to live in it right now. So to me, that's what's the most exciting, is that sort of look at not what's happening at the top of the 48th floor of the Gleaming Tower, but also like what's happening in the, you know, the folks who were displaced to build the 48th floor tower.
Ground level, right? Yeah.
I'd like to call back to one of the slides we had up earlier where it was evolution and it showed diversification.
Yeah.
The field, science fiction has diversified in themes, who's writing it, who's over the last 10 years, it's just really going wide. And that's probably one of the most exciting things to see happening in the field right now. We've got so many different viewpoints, far more than we had back in what would be called the golden age of science fiction. And I think that's what's making it exciting right now.
Last word, Alex, on this? And then we're going to wrap up our panel.
I always think that sort of like exposing the nuts and bolts of any genre thing is always worthwhile. I love your Jetsons example. I'm always fascinated by the way in which, people write space opera novels, and there's a lot of sort of essentially not so stealth feudalism in there. These depictions of future societies in which there are kind of like emperors and kings and things like this. Like, rarely do you get an extrapolation which really involves genuinely different culture or genuinely different political systems. People have a tendency to want to see sort of elements of reflections of their own lives in the things that they read, or all kinds of societies. There is this constant pull that happens in science fiction towards like the kinds of things that people know work. But it is great that science fiction is going broad, and I think it is contingent. We all, as writers, have a responsibility to continue to try to peek underneath the covers of every single genre trope that appears, and never let that go, because it's only when we sort of look at those pieces of sort of those slippery assumptions, those things that we're not attending to, that we actually start to realize that the world is always more subtle and more nuanced than we imagine. There's always stuff we're missing.
And science fiction doesn't have to live within a certain world, right? It can be anywhere. So that's the freedom that you have, and the promise, and also the hope you bring in your writing. So thank you so much for contributing to the conversation and your books. Yeah, thank you very much.